In the summer of 1945, Muzafar Sherif and his team of researchers taught two groups of 11 young boys to hate each other. Now, the way that Sherif got the two groups to hate each other was definitely interesting, but what was more interesting is how he got them to stop hating each other afterwards. This is Prejudice Reduction and the Robbers' Cave Experiment. Chapter 1. Definitions. Sohad Murrah, Sarah Gavak, and Marcus Brower describe prejudice as a negative or hostile attitude towards someone because they belong to a particular group. They also write that we start on the premise that prejudice entails favouring one's in-group and excluding, demeaning, and discriminating against members of an out-group solely because of their belonging to that group. So, prejudice is favouring your own group above other groups, and prejudice reduction is any number of methods which are used to, reduce prejudice. It's important to separate prejudice from discrimination here. If you think that members of Group X are bad, that's prejudice. If you're subconsciously biased against members of Group X, that's also prejudice. If you treat members of Group X worse than people who aren't in Group X, that's discrimination. A lot of the time this is a distinction without much of a difference, but it is important to keep difference in mind here because some methods of reducing prejudice might not actually have much effect on discrimination, which is more the goal. I know we're talking about prejudice reduction here, but obviously we want people to treat each other nicely, not just think nice things about each other. Chapter 2. Robbers' Cave. So let's go back to Muzafar Sherif, who, as you'll remember, was just in the middle of teaching two groups of boys to hate each other. These boys weren't very special, in fact they were very deliberately very similar to each other. After interviewing teachers and family, obtaining medical records, obtaining results of personality tests, and even observing their behaviour in the playground at school, Sherif concluded, with all this information we were able to assure ourselves that the boys chosen were of like kind and background. All were healthy, socially well-adjusted, somewhat above average in intelligence, and from stable, white, Protestant and middle-class homes. Once he had his two groups of 11 boys, each 11 or 12 years old, Sherif's experiment was made up of 3 phases, and I want to go through all of them in detail before we go into some of the criticisms of it, so you can see how it worked and what its conclusions were. In phase 1 of the experiment, the two groups were kept completely separate. This allowed them time to build up a group identity and group hierarchies. They also came up with their group names, one group called the Eagles and one group called the Rattlers. In phase 2, the experimenters deliberately made the two groups hate each other. They pitted them against each other in a variety of competitions, giving the winners prizes such as pocket knives and the losers nothing. Saul McLeod explains the other methods that Sherif used and some of the results. Situations were also devised whereby one group gained at the expense of the other. For example, one group was delayed getting to a picnic, and when they arrived the other group had eaten their food. At first this prejudice was only verbally expressed, such as taunting or name-calling. As the competition wore on, this expression took a more direct route. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. Then the next day the Rattlers ransacked the Eagles' cabin, overturned beds, and stole private property. The groups became so aggressive with each other that the researchers had to physically separate them. The third and final stage of the experiment was the part where the prejudice reduction comes in. Sherif initially attempted to reduce the tension between the groups by getting them to participate in activities together, such as watching a film together or celebrating the 4th of July with fireworks. But this didn't work, and Sherif wasn't really expecting it to either. What ultimately worked was a series of superordinate tasks. A superordinate task is a task that meets 2 criteria. 1, it must be compelling for the groups involved. That is, they both want to do it, and 2, it must be something that cannot be achieved by a single group through its own efforts and resources. Some examples of the superordinate tasks that Sherif concocted were unblocking a water faucet that the researchers had deliberately sabotaged and blamed on vandals, and pulling free a food truck that the boys happened to find stuck in place. Obviously people are willing to work together for food and water, but Sherif also did the same kind of thing by getting everyone to chip in to buy a film for them to watch. While just getting everyone to watch a film together didn't have much of an effect, after these superordinate tasks, the two groups were mixing together very well. So does that prove that superordinate tasks are the key to prejudice reduction? Well, not necessarily. McLeod, that's the guy who was explaining about the flag burning and cabin ransacking for us, has some pretty reasonable criticisms. I'll show you the entire conclusion section because it's short enough that it's worth reading. The events at Robbers' Cave mimic the kind of conflict that plague people all over the world. The simplest explanation for this conflict is competition. Assign strangers to groups, throw the groups into competition, stir the pot, and soon there is conflict. There is a lot of evidence that when people compete for scarce resources, e.g. jobs, land, etc., there is a rise in hostility between groups. For example, in times of high unemployment, there may be high levels of racism among white people who believe that black people or asylum seekers have taken their jobs. The study was a field experiment, which means it has high ecological validity. However, the Robbers Cave study has been criticised on a number of issues. For example, the two groups of boys in the study were artificial, as was the competition, and did not necessarily reflect real life. For example, middle-class boys randomly assigned into two separate groups is not rival inner-city gangs or rival football supporters. Ethical issues must also be considered. The participants were deceived as they did not know the true aim of the study. Also, participants were not protected from physical and psychological harm. Nor should the results be generalised to real life, because the research used only 12-year-old white middle-class boys and excluded, for example, girls and adults. So let's look at some more research to see if Sherif was onto something. Chapter 3! Intergroup Contact Theory. Gordon Allport's 2008 work, The Nature of Prejudice, which I managed to find the full text of online, has a chapter dedicated to intergroup contact theory, which is the idea that getting two different groups into contact with each other leads to prejudice reduction between the two groups just by them being next to each other, which is the opposite of what Sherif found when he tried to bring the Eagles and Rattlers together before using superordinate tasks. Allport looked at a variety of different examples of experimenters attempting just that, and concluded. Oh god, I have to do another American accent, hold on. In none of the studies cited in this chapter do we find that contact reduces prejudice among all of the individuals concerned. It does not do so even when the contact is of equal status in the pursuit of common goals. The reason is that certain personalities resist the influences of contact. One research by P.H. Musson sheds light on this matter. Paul Musson studied the effects of a 28-day biracial camp on the racial attitudes of white boys between 8 and 14 years old, but crucially Musson also performed personality tests on those boys and compared the personality traits of each boy to the effect that the camp had had on them, and found that the personalities of boys who were now less prejudiced tended to be less aggressive, less fearful, and with a more favourable attitude towards their parents, their home environment, and the camp that they had just been to. Conversely, more aggressive boys who disliked their parents and felt unsafe at home, who wanted to defy authority but feared the punishment that would follow, and who had disliked the camp and their fellow campers, were now more prejudiced than before. Unlike Sherif, Musson found that you could reduce prejudice with direct contact without having to use a superordinate task, but only for people who had good home lives and didn't feel fear and aggression. Does that mean that the key to avoiding racism is to love your mum, though? Well, not quite. Let's go back to Allport, whose conclusion from this whole debacle is as follows. It would seem fair, then, to conclude that contact as a situational variable cannot always overcome the personal variable in prejudice. This is true whenever the inner strain within the person is too tense, too insistent to permit him to profit from the structure of the outer situation. At the same time, given a population of ordinary people with a normal degree of prejudice, we are safe in making the following general prediction, which summarises the principal findings of this chapter. Prejudice, unless deeply rooted in the character structure of the individual, may be reduced by equal status contact between majority and minority groups in the pursuit of common goals. The effect is greatly enhanced if this contact is sanctioned by institutional supports, i.e. by law, custom, or local atmosphere, and provided it is of a sort that leads to the perception of common interests and common humanity between members of the two groups. In other words, the four keys to prejudice reduction are equal status, common goals, such as the superordinate tasks we heard about, institutional support, and common interests. Now, Allport was looking at 24 studies, which seems like enough to start drawing some conclusions from, but two scientists, Thomas Pettigrew and Linda Trop, decided that in order to be certain, they would need to look at slightly more, like, say, 515. Meta-analysis is the process by which you check a variety of other studies on a particular topic and see if they have any trends between them. Imagine you flip a coin 10 times and get 7 heads. You haven't done enough flips to confirm whether or not the coin is biased, and in fact there's about a 17% chance that you'll get 7 or more heads even with a completely unbiased coin. However, suppose that instead of flipping the coin yourself, you get 515 of your friends to flip the coin 10 times each, and then record their results. You can then basically just pretend that you flip the coin 5,150 times, and if you get 70% or even 52% of those flips coming up as heads, you can be pretty sure that your coin is biased. Your friends are doing individual analyses that don't really tell anyone much, and then your meta-analysis, even though it isn't actually adding any new information, is the part that actually tells people the stuff that means something helpful. So it's probably no surprise that Pettigrew and Chop come out with an abstract that has some of the most powerful energy from a scientific paper that I've seen in a while. The paragraph breaks here aren't from the original, but they make it so much easier to read. The present article presents a meta-analytic test of intergroup contact theory, with 713 independent samples from 515 studies. The meta-analysis finds that intergroup contact typically reduces intergroup prejudice. Multiple tests indicate that this finding appears not to result from either participant selection or publication biases, and the more rigorous studies yield larger mean effects. These contact effects typically generalize to the entire outgroup, and they emerge across a broad range of outgroup targets and contact settings. Similar patterns also emerge for samples with racial or ethnic targets and samples with other targets. This result suggests that contact theory, devised originally for racial and ethnic encounters, can be extended to other groups. A global indicator of Allport's optimal contact conditions demonstrates that contact under these conditions typically leads to even greater reduction in prejudice. Closer examination demonstrates that these conditions are best conceptualized as an interrelated bundle rather than independent factors. Further, the meta-analytic findings indicate that these conditions are not essential for prejudice reduction. Hence, future work should focus on negative factors that prevent intergroup contact from diminishing prejudice, as well as the development of a more comprehensive theory of intergroup contact. So, in summary, intergroup contact does work, and it works for reducing all kinds of prejudice even though it was just designed for reducing racism, and the effects are even better if you meet Allport's 4 conditions, and it still works even without them, so long as there aren't any negative factors like the ones that Musson found with his biracial camp experiment that might be preventing prejudice reduction. This is a major caveat, but it's still a phenomenal result, and the entire paper by Pettigrew and Chop is free to read online. I really recommend it if you want to try reading a scientific paper for yourself. It's semi-approachable, and I might do a video on it in more detail. Let me know if you're interested in that. So anyway, that's intergroup contact theory. Except it gets weirder. As well as intergroup contact theory, there's the imagined contact hypothesis. The idea behind this hypothesis is that just by imagining yourself to have positive interactions with a member of another group, you can change the way you think about people in that group for the better. This potentially has implications for diversity in media, particularly in video games where you personally control the character who's interacting with or is a member of a minority group. And it also has implications for parasocial relationships, like the kind of one-sided relationship that you have with a celebrity figure who isn't necessarily even aware that you exist. It's possible that if you play video games with a bisexual protagonist, or if your favourite YouTuber is trans, then that will actually affect your views on members of gender and sexual minorities. So, is the hypothesis true? Well, our next paper with a truly wild abstract comes from Rhiannon Turner, Richard Crisp, and Emily Lambert. The paragraph breaks are again mine. We investigated whether simply imagining contact with outgroup members can improve intergroup attitudes. In Experiment 1, young participants who imagined talking to an elderly person subsequently showed lower levels of intergroup bias than participants who imagined an outdoor scene. In Experiment 2, young participants who imagined talking to an elderly person subsequently showed lower levels of intergroup bias than participants who simply thought about elderly people, ruling out a priming explanation for our findings. In Experiment 3, heterosexual men who imagined talking to a homosexual man subsequently evaluated homosexual men more positively, perceived there to be greater variability among them, and experienced less intergroup anxiety compared to a control group. The effect of imagined contact on outgroup evaluations was mediated by reduced intergroup anxiety. These findings suggest that imagining intergroup contact could represent a viable alternative for reducing prejudice where actual contact between groups is impractical. So, in summary, just thinking about talking to people might be able to make you less prejudiced against them. That's pretty amazing, and again, the entire paper is available free online to read, and I highly recommend it. There's some tough maths you might just have to smile and nod through, but the majority of it is very easy to understand. One possible criticism of Turner, Crisp and Lambert's paper is that it has a very small sample size, But there are other papers that come to similar conclusions, including another by Crispin Turner, and a paper by Michael Jacob, Arthur Stukas, and John Farrell, which demonstrated that both imagined and real contact had positive effects on attitudes towards people with schizophrenia. Okay, I think that one was actually less bad than the American ones. Having multiple studies reaching similar conclusions is helpful to increase the confidence we have in these techniques actually working, even if it's not the same as a meta-analysis. So that's intergroup contact and imagined contact. But what other ways do we have to reduce prejudice? Chapter 4: Social Identity Theory. Social identity theory generally refers to the idea that people have different identities or categories that they fall into, such as being white, being a woman, being straight, or being a liberal, and crucially, they have these identities whether they openly acknowledge them or not. Like, I know when we think of identity, we think of, like, I identify as being part of this group, but in this case, identity just means a thing that is true of a person, even if they don't necessarily make that identity part of their identity. Got that? So, one possible method of prejudice reduction is decategorization. Incidentally, I just want you to know that in the original script for this, I did the superordinate tasks voice with every new term. Decategorization is just a fancy word which means trying to get people to stop thinking of themselves as being part of specific categories. For example, Anne Betancourt, Marilyn Brewer, Marion Croak, and Norman Miller investigated the effects of the salience of a particular group, that is, how aware people were that they were part of that group, on prejudice reduction, and found that by reducing the salience, they could have a better effect on prejudice reduction. On the other hand, there's a major problem with decategorization, and it's that you can have a hard time recognizing racial injustice if you don't see race. In her book, Privilege Revealed: How Invisible Preference Undermines America, Stephanie Wildman goes into detail about the problems this can cause, and a study by Stephanie Freiberg and Nicole Stevens is one of many studies which show that this isn't just a theoretical problem. I am not black or from the USA, so I'm pretty unqualified to talk about colourblind racism in the USA, but the very simplified version is that if you don't see race, you aren't going to be able to pick up on patterns. For example, if you see that an employer hires some people and doesn't hire some people, then that doesn't tell you much. But if you see that the employer does hire white applicants and doesn't hire black applicants, then you know the employer is being racist. But you have to be able to see race in order to be able to see racism. Oh, and remember right at the beginning when I told you that it was important to keep prejudice and discrimination separate? Well, one of the conclusions of experiments into colourblind racism is that even if people who claim to be colourblind may be less prejudiced, they're actually more likely to discriminate and accept discrimination, because they fail to recognise their own and other people's discriminatory behaviour. A study by Evan Apfelbaum, Kristin Palka, Samuel Somers, and Nalini Ambady showed that children who were taught colourblind ideologies were less likely to call out overtly racist incidents when they came across them, for example. Naturally, this entire line of logic probably also works the same way with any other type of prejudice, so let's look at other ways of using social identity theory that are, bad. Research by John DeVito, Samuel Gertner, and Tamar Sagwai shows that recategorization, which invites people to think of themselves as members of an overarching supercategory rather than as individual categories, can be useful to reduce prejudice. Think about terms like people of faith rather than Christian or Muslim. Alternatively, cross-categorization, which is the idea of emphasizing a different set of groups that are shared rather than the groups that are different, also has some success. For example, if you have some British Christians and some British Muslims and you want them to get along, you want them to think of themselves as British rather than Christians and Muslims. These both have the obvious limitation that they rely on strong-arming in-group mentality into doing the work for you rather than actually making people okay with members of out-groups. So, social identity theory has some possible ways of reducing prejudice, but all of them have potential issues, and intergroup contact theory has limitations on who it can affect and how much. Let's look at a few other ways of reducing prejudice. Bonus round. Ways of reducing prejudice that didn't fit into any other category. Imagining yourself in someone else's shoes, reading about the effects prejudice has on other people, watching videos about the effects prejudice has on other people, attempting to suppress prejudice beliefs, reconditioning biases into more positive associations, better education in general, learning that personality traits are learned and changeable, believing that prejudice against a particular group is unusual among the subject's peers, believing that prejudice goes against the core values of their peers, being asked to justify their own prejudice to confront them with their own inability to explain, increasing your self-esteem so you don't feel as though you need another group to feel superior to. As we've probably come to expect by now, all of these have their own caveats. For example, trying to recondition biases into more positive associations can lead to the model minority problem, which basically means using positive stereotypes about one minority as a bludgeon to beat another minority with. That's not to say that it's hopeless, though. If we implement these strategies well in real life, rather than just keeping them theoretical, or implementing them without consideration for the possible drawbacks, then we can actually combat the growing tide of prejudice in the world. So how well are we implementing these techniques? Chapter 5. We are not implementing these techniques. Hundreds of workplaces and schools use some form of diversity training, but most interventions are not grounded in theory, and there is little evidence of program impact. So that was Elizabeth Pallock and her work Diversity Training and Intergroup Contact, a Call to Action Research, which is a scathing review of workplace diversity days, even at one point comparing them to a scene in American TV show The Office. In short, the vast majority of diversity workshops aren't based on evidence and have no measurable positive effect. Dominic Abrams, writing for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, however, is much more cautious about saying that current strategies have no effect. The lack of evidence is as much due to poor methodology as inadequate media strategies. Mike Sutton, Barbara Perry, Jonathan Park, and Catherine Jean-Baptiste are not scientists, at least not to my knowledge, but they did produce a work for the UK's Department of Communities and Local Government, which I can absolutely cite as though it were a scientific paper. Anyway, they make the following suggestions based on their research. If a source is seen as having credibility, attractiveness, expertise, status, and power, it is more likely to reduce prejudice. Repetition of the message is more likely to reduce prejudice. Use of facts and information is not sufficient to change attitudes. An initiative aimed at those who practice racial discrimination might be unintentionally patronising to those who experience its impacts firsthand. When presenting a message, contrast is key. Salient communications are more likely to get the intended recipient's attention. A message is more likely to be effective if it is straightforward, jargon-free, and avoids emotionally extreme language. Or, put more simply, make something that looks good, repeat the message, make sure you're clear, that you're not patronising, and that you appeal to people's emotions without using emotionally extreme language or ignoring facts entirely. Conclusion. Prejudice reduction is achieved primarily through encouraging people to engage in mutually beneficial activity with members of groups they might otherwise consider an outgroup, to recategorize or decategorize those outgroups in ways which allow them to be part of the same group, and to imagine the day-to-day struggles of dissimilar people and learn about their lives so as to empathise with them better. Equal status, common goals, institutional support such as legal or cultural backing, and common interests can act as a catalyst for prejudice reduction, but aren't always necessary. Messages in favour of these goals are best received when they come from sources that are seen as members of an in-group with some backing by their peers, and it's possible to apply a pressure to conform to the beliefs of those peers by directing attention to common opposition to prejudice. Messages must be repeated, and simple presentation of facts is insufficient to change views. In general, because of the many and varied models of human interaction, which each have their own merits, there is room to explore a multifaceted design which combines elements from multiple methods of prejudice reduction in a single design solution. Finally, reduction of prejudice is often not enough to affect the kind of change we would want to see in terms of reducing actual discrimination, and many of these techniques can cause problems elsewhere if they aren't applied sensibly, but if they're well applied, these techniques can cause people to be less prejudiced and hopefully to treat each other better as well. Thank you for still being here to the end of that, much appreciated. I'm thinking of turning this into a regular series where I do a different science deep dive every, I want to say week, but this video took a lot of time to make. But anyway, let me know if you want to see more content like this and what kinds of things you would like to see me go into in far more depth than is strictly necessary. So if this is at all popular, I'll see you all on the next one.